So my name is Dr. Sarai Aharoni, and I come from Israel, from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. And I'm really happy to be here with you and to share some insights from a recent study that we've conducted in Israel about feminist organizations, women's policy agencies, and how to use data to understand long trends in the development of this institutional field. So I don't know if many of you know, but Israel has a very, very large and creative feminist movement and a women's movement, which predates the creation of the state in 1948. And many people know we are a high-tech nation, but we are also a feminist hub. And it is interesting to see that these two worlds almost never meet. So while feminists engage in, a street protest, educational projects, workshops, dialogue groups, skill building, and very important social services to women and other groups, high-tech companies are engaged in developing apps, in creating scientific explorations, and of course in creating this very, very big market, which of course then moves on to financial exits, etc. And these worlds rarely meet. So one of the questions that we had when we started this research project was, how do we actually use, or can we use data to preserve feminist knowledge? We have traditional ways of thinking about these organizations, for example, through interviews or ethnographies, or using written sources. And many of these forms of data or knowledge is stored in what we call archives, right? These pictures show you how feminist archives look like. These are not accessible archives. These are places, sometimes they're private archives, a certain study room in a woman's home, right? But maybe this room has very, very important information about historical struggles that women were engaged in, like, anti-trafficking projects, or skill building for poor women, or women in peace groups, right? So we really have a lot of important historical information about the way these women were trying to change the world. And this is not accessible. And sometimes it is not accessible because these women act as keepers. They don't really want everyone to know what is in there, right? So it's not only lack of resources or a lack of connections. Working with feminist archives is a very, very tricky thing, but we tried and we actually succeeded in creating a project that was meant to use data, use a computer software, a specific software we developed, to track all the different Israeli NGOs, women's NGOs, feminist organizations, and policy mechanisms. By doing this, we are engaging with recent theoretical debates about how to use data as feminists. And maybe some of you have read this very, very important book that was published in 2020 that tries to capture or to speak about 7 principles for challenging power and privilege using data science. And these principles are really important guidelines to think about how to use data differently to actually enhance different forms of knowledge that are not mainstream in a sense that we think about high-tech or about programming. So for example, by examining power relations, right? What kind of knowledge gets to be used in when we think about AI, when we think about data projects? How can we create projects that challenge these power relations? How do we deal with messy data, for example, about emotions or about bodies? How do we code, right? Why do we need these to clean data? Or what happens when we think about data as something that we cannot really clean, or that we need to think about in a creative way to reflect the paradoxes that happen in real lives, right? Because, for example, I I study a social movement. And in social movements, it's very hard for me to think about a clear path to success. It's always about moving forward and then moving backward and then failing and then succeeding, right? So how do we capture this in a real way? So they really, in this book, we really can learn about options to embrace pluralistic views about data, to consider the context in which this data is being produced, and of course, to make the labor of those who work in data-related science and projects visible. So what did we do? We created a data set that is called the Women's Policy Agencies, Feminist Organizations and Machineries for Gender Equality in Israel. It's mainly in Hebrew because it is a public data set, and it is meant for Israeli women to actually be able to understand their history, the historical trail of the feminist movement in their own language. What we did was we created a very broad definition of what qualifies as an institution. We looked for all the agencies or machineries that originated from the state. We looked for organizations and services that originated from civil society, and also organizations that could be traced back to international groups or agencies. We then expanded our definition to include any kind of organization or mechanism that was meant for the advancement of women, also feminist organizing, so it was either women or feminist and or the promotion of gender more generally, which includes LGBT plus rights. So we have a very, very broad definition of women, feminism, gender. Our data collection phase, it took about 2 years, and we were able to trace almost 600 mechanisms, and we coded them by hand. So each mechanism was coded to reflect the following aspects: name, period of activity, type of activity, location, sector, and subgroups, whether the organization is, for example, working with ultra-Orthodox women or immigrants from the Soviet Union or LGBT groups, etc. The public database looks like this. This is in Hebrew. So a person can enter the database and can search, for example, according to field of activity. And what I'm showing you now is what happens when a person searches a field and wants to learn about, for example, the field of violence, right? So what can we learn when we search the subfield of violence in the data set? So here's what we see. We get this interesting graph that shows the development of institutions from 1970 to 2018. And what we see clearly is a growth, right? We really see this very, very rapid growth. And we see that this is a very important sector or a very important field in this specific social movement. And the colors, the different colors here are the very bright yellow is domestic violence. So these are organizations or entities that work on domestic violence. The darker yellow is relates to organizations that work on sexual violence. So that's a different kind of violence. And then the smaller portion of organizations, which appears much later, are groups that work on sexual harassment. So we can see that these different interpretations of what is gender-based violence appear in different times, and we see their expansion pattern. When we did linear analysis with our data, we actually could see that violence is very, very dominant in the field, right? You can see the purple line here. So when we compare it to any other field or topic that these organizations deal with, we see that violence is really one of the most dominant issues in which the Israeli women's movement is dealing, and I wonder how this plays out in other places, right? When we slice the data according to type, so remember, I was able to code each organization according to the sector. So when I look at the same graph, but I try to see what is the sector? Okay, we can see that the purple color says that all of these groups are NGOs. We see a very dominant presence of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and the pink here is the governmental organizations. So we can actually see that these are the most dominant sectors that work on violence against women in Israel. We see a lot of NGOs and a lot of government mechanisms. And then we can ask questions about the relationship between NGOs, right, between civil society groups and governmental mechanisms. Now, what we see here is not something that we knew before. This is a very important thing to say. Until we had this picture, we were not able to understand the actual ratio between state services and non-state services. So this is why these kinds of projects are very important. They can tell us a story that we maybe know in a very different way. Moving on, this is just showing you another way to slice the data. This is according to the types of activities. So we see that in the field of violence, most of the activities are services, and this is very, very dominant. So organizations that deal with violence don't really do a lot of protest, or they don't really engage in public policy. They do services. They supply services. And this, of course, raises a range of questions which I don't really have time to address here, but you can see the way the same data is sliced differently. Over time, we could explain the overall pattern of this data set. We see that the growth in this field occurs basically in the 1990s, when we see a rapid rise in the number of groups that engage in women's issues. And we can see this expansion in terms of the different populations that engage or are represented here. We really see a very interesting diversity of groups that are engaging with women's rights and feminist issues. So I'll skip this. As you can see, we're seeing two very, very important sectors, the NGO sector and the government sector, which the NGO sector is really larger than the government sector. And this, again, can tell us an interesting story about who are the driving forces, who are the entrepreneurs, right? Women are entrepreneurs in civil society, and they create a movement. And then the government catches up. When we look at the trends, we can see that it is always, in the last 50 years, that Israeli non-governmental institutions rise, and then the states follows. Again, we can learn about the importance of civil society in promoting women's rights. So, using data as feminists can help us trace very complex patterns of change in women's organizing over time. It can preserve histories of unrepresented and marginalized groups, because we also have access to each and every mechanism. Women can click every name, and they can read a short history about each one of those almost 600 groups that we coded. So that is, of course, a project of accessibility, right? It can foster digital curiosity and digital literacy among feminists who usually are not interested in data, in big data or in data projects. It can challenge traditional modes of classification, because we have a lot of questions, right? How do we classify each group? And it can lead to public and open access sources of data on women's lives. And of course, this is the way to cite the data that we have. And this was not possible without a very big and diverse research team at Ben-Gurion University. Thank you. Do we have time for questions, or is it?
We have like 2 minutes or so, if we have any questions. Do we have, by show of hands? All right. I think not now, but thank you so much, Sarai.
I think there is a...
Okay, Anna has a question. Great question. Okay, so I
I would encourage to create a working group to explore feminism and data here in Latvia. So addressing small groups of women who are usually very remote from data technologies, and trying to encourage a dialogue to understand how do they think about using big data or coding for complicated projects. And I think this what we call feminist curiosity is a starting point for new projects that sometimes we cannot even imagine when we start a journey like that.
Thank you. Any more questions? We have time for one more. Okay. All right, I can't see any hands, but I think it's just a lot to take in,
Yes.
And we all need to use more data as feminists, as we saw.
Right, and if you'd like to contact me for more technical issues, because the code is open, the data, the code is open, and we can share it if anybody is interested.
Great. Let's give a round of applause to Sarai. Thank you so much.